At Rico, we make TMI work for the insurance industry. From automated customer onboarding to accurate invoice processing to your claim was approved, there's no such thing as too much information. Our experts unlock the power of your trapped information so you can spend more time focused on what matters most. Your customers. We love TMI. Rico. Imagine change.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at a very interesting part of North Carolina history, and that is ferries. Ferries in North Carolina, but specifically a ferry in Bladen County known as the Elwell Ferry. And Chris, this ferry, it started in 1905, but ferries go back into the colonial period.
Yeah, absolutely. When we start thinking about this ferry, if anyone is in southeastern Bladen County, you have the opportunity to go and experience a marvel of transportation. Today, we're so focused on bridges and subways and trains and other modes of transportation. But back in the day, and including in colonial times, this was a quick mode of transportation. This was the way that you would travel goods and services and just for recreation purposes along the Cape Fear River. So I'm looking forward and maybe sharing with our readers and our listeners this rare and pleasant jewel that once again is located here in Bladen County.
Yeah, there's a number of types of ferries. Today when we think of ferries, we may often think of the large ferries that you drive cars on, and down in those familiar with Southport, North Carolina, there's a pretty large ferry there. But a lot of these ferries dating back in the colonial times and, up until the early 20th century, they weren't these big, nice ferries that you drive your car on. A lot of these ferries, especially during colonial periods, were basically flat bottom boats that you could carry or you could pull up a horse on or a trailer or whatever, and they would use oars sometimes they would use lines to pull the trailer or car off. So of course, when engines became available, they put gas engines on the back of some of these, and it was just simply a way to get from one side of the river to another, because we think about the Elwell Ferry, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and it only travels 110 yards across the river. But if you were trying to cross the river in the early 20th century, that saved you a lot of time by getting on that ferry and just going straight across the river instead of trying to go all the way around. So these ferries, even though the small inland ferries like Elwell Ferry weren't necessarily the most technologically advanced, they weren't large, they weren't anything really to look at. They served a very important purpose, and unfortunately, it's sort of a dying breed of ferry. Elwell Ferry at one point was the last ferry of its type, inland river ferry, running in North Carolina at one point. So let's get into talking a little bit about the ferry. So let's take a few moments and let's look at Elwell Ferry itself, Chris. Of course, like we said earlier, I think it started in 1905. And right now, I think I said a few minutes ago that it was, at one point, it was the last remaining inland river ferry in North Carolina. And as we'll talk about a little later, it's not operating right now. But Chris, let's go back to 1905 and let's talk about the beginning of Elwell Ferry with Walter Hayes Russ and John Rowland Russ.
I think, you were mentioning earlier kind of the original intent of ferries, especially during the colonial days. And the original Elwell Ferry, as you mentioned, 1905, it had the capacity of carrying one mule and one wagon, and it was fitted with oars. And you rowed across the Cape Fear, with these oars. So it wasn't like this nice little journey for the people who operated the particular ferry, the Russ brothers. For a while, it was operated by Bladen County government, and they paid the Russ brothers $25 a month
to row these mules and wagons and other items across the river, if you will. And then in the 1930s, the state of North Carolina decided to take over the operation of the Elwell Ferry, even though they still used the Russ brothers. But what started to happen is, instead of using oars, they created this unique cable ferry system where they used cables on one side of the river and then on the other side of the river. And basically, still, instead of having the oar, now what you would do is you had this heavy wire cable, and they had this kind of pull stick that they would use to be able to go across the river. So you can kind of imagine. People are familiar with these individuals who are doing CrossFits and America's Ninja Warrior, and they're doing all of these heavy arm exercises. Well, I would imagine that the Russ brothers and anybody else who operated the Elwell Ferry, by having to pull a mule and wagon with this ferry from one side to the next, it had to be strenuous. And not only strenuous, but it was also dangerous. And, you also have ships that are traversing the Cape Fear River. And so, you have this cable that is across the river. And so when a ship is coming, or a boat, the unique thing about this is they could release that cable, and it would float, or it would go sink all the way down to the bottom of the Cape Fear River. It would allow the boats to pass through, and then they would be able to pull it back up and attach it and send the ferry back off. And that would last until about 1940. And then I think 1940, they come up with the gas-powered engine to be able to move the ferry across. But that also increases the danger of operating the ferry.
Yeah, and when you think about the oarsmen who were originally operating the ferry, and then when they were manually pulling the ferry with the cables, the Cape Fear River, for those who are not familiar with it, it runs, I guess it runs into the Atlantic Ocean through Wilmington, North Carolina. It is a fairly wide river, and it is also, especially during times of heavy rain, it's also it's a very dangerous river because there's a lot of currents and a lot of, fast moving water through that river. So it could actually be, like you said, very dangerous. It's not just the other ships or boats that you have to worry about. It's also the current of the river. And Chris, I just cannot imagine, knowing the Cape Fear River the way I do, having to oar a boat like the Elwell Ferry across the river in some of those conditions with the currents as strong as they are.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that too often in today's society, we're so used to technology and automation of things that we use the illustration of a car. We now have automatic transmissions. If we go back to those who remember the days of having a manual transmission of a car, and how you had to shift gears, and there were different things you had to do with the clutch and the brake and the accelerator, it required more work. Well, imagine for a moment that you have to keep as straight a line as you possibly can, crossing that 120 yards from one side to the other side. And if you have the swollen river, with the massive current, just trying to keep it on one, to keep it as straight as possible, had to be an arduous task. And I think great appreciation needs to be given to the Russ brothers. They only had $25 a month that they were getting for moving these people across. And by the way, this was the primary means of transportation, of getting from one side of the river to the other side of the river.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, in recent years, during Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, or at other times where there's been a lot of rain, they would shut the ferry down to wait for the currents to calm down, to wait for the water to go down a little bit. Of course, back in the day, if you shut it down, that could really restrict the ability of people to get goods and mules and services, et cetera, across the Cape Fear River. So it was a very big deal to shut it down. So I imagine they probably didn't want to shut it down as much.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, that even back in the 1980s, 1990s, I remember that there was this requirement that if you were hired to operate the Elwell Ferry, you had to go through this extensive training because it was the cable operated, and that you had to have a specific license to operate Elwell Ferry. And one of the things that I remembered in the research is that the license that you had to have wasn't required for the larger vessels that were navigating the widening river. So in other words, operating the ferry was more of a challenge than navigating a large vessel up and down the Cape Fear River, which just speaks to the power of the small ferry and the amount of diligence you had to have in operation of it.
Yeah, it could be very dangerous. And every once in a while, even today, we'll hear of large ferries, especially in overseas countries, tipping over and killing hundreds of people. And I believe even here in the United States, a few years ago, there was a tour ferry that sank and a number of people passed away as a result of that. And even though the Elwell Ferry and ferries like it may only carry, a few people, the last thing you wanted to have happen was the thing to tip over and whatever was being transported across the river, but more importantly, the people end up in the river with strong currents. And, in the Cape Fear River, there are alligators, there are water moccasins, depending on the time of the year. So that could be a very dangerous situation for anybody to fall into that water like that.
Elwell Ferry is located in a very isolated area. There's not a lot that's out there. You pretty much have to find Elwell Ferry to get there. And so it does allow for the observation of numerous types of wildlife. And I know that there have been instances of bear and deer, and as you mentioned, the animals of the water also. So we know that the operation, you didn't get paid a lot. You had to have a license. It was very strenuous. We mentioned about the danger involved in it, but the Rust brothers, who were pretty much the original operators of the ferry, experienced tragedy, as have others throughout the years of the Elwell Ferry. And I think you had some good information about some of the dangerous issues that have occurred with the ferry, whether operation or simply traversing it.
Yeah, there have been throughout history that I could find, there have been 4 people who perished on the Elwell Ferry. One of them, interestingly enough, was Walter Rust himself, one of the founders of the Elwell Ferry. He died in 1942 in an engine explosion. I guess when the fumes, and I don't know much about engines, but the fumes in the engine built up and it exploded, killing him. In 1967, 2 men jumped off the Elwell Ferry committing suicide. And that, I think, goes back to what we said a few minutes ago, that even though it wouldn't have been like a long jump into the river itself, just falling into the river in the wrong place at the wrong time could definitely prove fatal. Then one that I actually remember, I was in college when this happened, probably dating myself there a little bit, but in 1994, 2 men died when they were trying to push an oversized vehicle on the ferry, and I guess the ferry tipped and killed them. So, we're talking about the dangers and risks of operating a ferry like the Elwell Ferry. It wasn't the most stable thing in the world. It was running across a very current-driven, choppy river at times. So it could be quite a dangerous task. And, the evidence of that is that William Rust, one of the founders and originators of the Elwell Ferry, died trying to operate the ferry in 1942.
And talking about the dangers and the other things that were involved in this, it is also worth noting that as the ferry has developed and as people have come and gone, there recently, before the ferry was shut down to a variety of issues, it was one of only 3 two-car ferries that were in operation in North Carolina, and it was the only ferry that was operated by women. So if we think about this, here was this ferry that at some point took about 2 to 5 guys to be able to push that ferry across, using the pull cables and the winches and the oars. And then it moved to this idea of 2 women who were operating the ferry on their own. But just because it was diesel powered and it had become this steel vessel didn't mean that it got any easier. I mean, it was a very difficult and demanding job, even recently, because the swollen rivers and understanding the dynamics of how water works and keeping it level. I think that there is history to that. And by the way, if our listeners are interested in learning more about these ladies who were involved in running the Elwell Ferry, the New York Times, a premier newspaper, did a wonderful article about Bladen County, and their sole focus was on these two ladies who were in operation of the Elwell Ferry. So readers could go and take a look at, I think the title was 24 Hours in America with the New York Times, and does a really good job of giving a little history to the Elwell Ferry and also the women who were behind it. It's interesting, before they closed it down, that, you know, the ferry isn't like a ferry down towards the coast where there's ferry schedules and ferry times and things like that. Basically, if you pulled up and you wanted to ride the ferry and it was on the other side, all you basically did was honk the horn, they'd wave, come on over, pick you up and take you back. And that was one of the beautiful things about riding the ferry, is it kind of took you back in time, and you could kind of imagine how life used to be back then.
Yeah, it's part of that bygone era type stuff. And I think we've sort of hinted around at it, but as of February 2021, the ferry is not operational. I believe it shut down in the spring of 2020. And I don't know what future plans there are for the ferry, if there are any plans to reopen it at this particular time. So, but you can still, if you go down Highway 53 toward Kelly, North Carolina, you can still, I guess, go down there. And I don't know, I haven't been down there recently, but you maybe can go down there and at least see where the ferry once operated. I'm glad you mentioned the newspaper article. I had completely forgot this until you mentioned it, but a few years ago, I heard the guy who wrote that article speak on the Elwell Ferry, and I had forgotten about that until you mentioned that article. So it's a very neat thing, especially neat that, you know, the New York Times, somewhere like that, is talking about, you know, this ferry out in the middle of rural Bladen County in southeastern North Carolina.
And one of the things that I would just encourage our listeners to think through is, we are here in Bladen County, and we try to share stories about things that happen in Bladen County, but also important events throughout history that we think are important to know. But I want to encourage the listeners to take a few moments and to think about their local context, where they're located, and to just discover all of these hidden gems in their respective areas. History is alive and well in so many different parts of our world, and what it takes is just a little investigation, a little exploration, and you'll find some really neat things in your area, things that maybe you can send us and let us know about, so that we can become familiar with those topics. And maybe it's even a great future edition of our podcast. So I really love the Elwell Ferry. I love the historical aspect to it, but also I love hearing about the bravery that the men and women who operated that ferry. I think we just continue to see it as a mode of transportation, and we need to go back and remember that in everything that is done, there is an element of danger. There's hard work. There's learning and education that comes with this. And next time you cross the Cape Fear, or you cross any river, and you look out and you see what looks like a nice, beautiful river, just think about the eras gone by and how that was the mode of transportation. And imagine crossing the river, or just going up and down the river, the Cape Fear, or whatever other river it is. I think there's a lot of history there, and it reminds us just of determination and diligence.
Yeah, there's history all around. Doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter where you go, there's history all around you, and most likely you've never read it in a textbook, but that doesn't make it any less important. Thank you, Chris, for your help with this particular episode. Great research, great work. We look forward to talking with everyone again next week. If you have any ideas or comments, feel free to email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, at gmail.com. And we'll talk to you later. Have a great day.